I was a ranger in Yellowstone for about 18 years. I retired and moved to the Pacific Northwest in 2016, but I still visit Yellowstone often and remain friends with many of my former colleagues. This encounter happened during the fall of 2008 near Canyon Village on the north side of the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, right off the Grand Loop Road, Route 89. It was nighttime around 8 p.m. when my wife noticed something unusual while driving our car down Highway 89 heading towards West Thumb Geyser Basin, also located near Canyon Village. The area between Roosevelt Arch and West Thumb Geyser is very remote at night, with only 2 gas stations for light along the Grand Loop Road, one at each end approximately 10 miles apart from each other, in addition to small clusters of campgrounds. Anyway, as we're driving through the north entrance gate into Yellowstone National Park, we both saw a beige-colored 4-legged animal running alongside our vehicle next to an empty trailer hitch on the back of a blue pickup in front of us. The animal was keeping pace with our vehicle and ran like a dog or a coyote, but it was much larger than either one. I would estimate that it was at least the size of a German Shepherd, but it had a long snout, more like a coyote, and its fur also looked different than either a dog or a coyote's. From what we could see in the darkness, the creature's fur appeared to be coarse like that of a wolf. The most unusual thing about this animal is that it appeared to be running on its hind legs only, sort of like how a human would run, interchanging between 4 and 2 legs. It didn't seem to be using its front legs at all, at least for part of the time. It would also change, and it was running at a loping gait like wolves do when they run. Its front hind legs were longer than most quadrupeds would be, and we were both wondering why we had not seen this animal before since it was so large, and we do travel through the area frequently. We never saw anything like it again after that night. Also, since I am an avid hunter of big game animals, I know what every animal in Yellowstone looks like, especially the 4-legged mammals and some birds. This creature wasn't any of those things. I don't know what this creature was, but whatever it may have been, my wife and I both agree that what we saw was a canine or wolf-like bipedal animal running alongside Highway 89 near Canyon Village during the fall of 2008. The fact that it could interchange between 4 legs and 2 legs at its own whim is impressive and terrifying. And I think what disturbs me most about the story is that whatever animal we saw that evening clearly was not a natural inhabitant of Yellowstone National Park. Also, my father shared an interesting experience that coincides with what happened to me. He used to work as a park ranger in the early 1970s at Canyon Village in Yellowstone National Park. And one night while working the night shift, he saw a very large bipedal animal cross in front of his patrol car that he simply could not identify. He described it as being similar to a human, but much larger and covered in black, shiny fur. This occurred in the same general area where I had my encounter. My father retired several years ago and moved to Florida. For a time, he did live in Cody, Wyoming, near Yellowstone National Park, and I've been thinking about sharing my experience with him and asking him if he remembers seeing anything similar during his time as a ranger. The other odd thing is that the year 2008 was also a strange year for Bigfoot sightings all across Idaho, especially in places like West Idaho. There were also some unusual anomalies witnessed by my paranormal activist friends during this same time period. They say that it coincides with the 2008 crash. I don't know what to make of it. Whatever we saw that evening was not any kind of known animal from Yellowstone National Park, or anywhere else for that matter. If you have any ideas regarding what I saw that evening, please comment below. It would be great to finally figure out what that creature was. Thanks for your help. In the wake of a week following a bewildering event, my attempts to reconcile what unfolded that fateful night have proved impossible. Growing up in the suburbs of New York, I always preferred the straightforward reality of my accounting job over fanciful stories. That was until my encounter in the wilderness that has left me questioning my reality. Years ago, I adopted hiking as a form of stress relief. It is an escape from the mundane of everyday life, looking at numbers in exchange for a backpack and a tent once in a while. Although I am city-born and bred, I found solace in the quiet of the forests and predictability of the wilderness. The sound of nature has a rhythmic pattern that is comforting, a contrast to the noises of my urban life. All this was before that one fateful encounter which stands as a stark reminder that the world may hold secrets far beyond our comprehension. Just over a week ago, I had an encounter I'm still struggling to process. I'm not normally the type to get spooked, but this experience was different, very different. The first hint that something was off was the smell. I was camping out in a secluded part of the Adirondack Mountains when this pungent odor overwhelmed me. It was like sulfur, so strong it made the back of my throat itch. I thought maybe it was just the smell of the natural sulfur springs nearby, but it was too intense and, well, out of place. Before the encounter, I'd been out on a week-long solo hiking trip. The plan was to do some wildlife photography, nothing more. The night before the incident, I'd set up my camp near a dense thicket of trees by a small creek. I was familiar with the area, having visited it multiple times over the years. Everything had been peaceful, normal, until that smell hit me. As the odor got stronger, I started to hear rustling sounds around my camp. Thinking it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon, I decided to ignore it and try to get some sleep. But the sounds grew louder, the sulfur smell stronger, and I knew something wasn't right. Then, out of the darkness, this thing stepped into the small circle of light provided by my campfire. Its height was striking, easily 6 feet tall, maybe more. The first thing I noticed was the head. It was somewhat similar to a horse, elongated and demonic-looking, like some kind of bizarre goblin creature out of a horror film. The eyes were the next thing that caught my attention. They were glowing a terrifying red, which switched back and forth to a piercing yellow. The body was a blend of various creatures, yet all merged together in a way that was seamless, in a terrifying sort of way. It had hocked legs, and its body resembled some sort of lizard, covered in dark brown and black scaled skin. Skeletal structures protruded in odd angles along the creature's exterior, giving it an appearance akin to wearing an exterior skull. Its back was crowned with what looked like the wings of a bat, folded tight against its body. The creature didn't do anything, not at first. It just stood there, looking at me. We stared at each other, the only sound being the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a night bird. It felt like an eternity, locked in this staring contest with this thing. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature turned and retreated back into the darkness, the rustling sounds fading, followed by the smell of sulfur. In the aftermath, all that remained was a faint glow from its eyes in the darkness and a disturbed peace. I have been hiking and camping all my life, and I've seen my share of wildlife and the occasional stray dog. But this was different. This creature wasn't anything I could identify, nor anything I've ever heard of. I don't know what it was, where it came from, or why it was there. All I know is what I saw, what I smelled, and the unsettling feeling that stayed with me long after it was gone. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of a creature like this, but any insight you might have would be appreciated. I'll read your comments. I'm a forest ranger stationed in the Ozark Mountains, Arkansas. Been on the job for about a decade. It's been a regular enough life until one particular night last year. That's when things went odd. I was on a routine patrol, following up on reports of strange animal noises and disturbances that had been troubling the local campers. We've got bears and bobcats, but this was different, much odder. The first strange thing I noticed was an eerie silence that had settled in. No night critters making their usual noise. Felt like even the wind was holding its breath. Second, I found traces of unusual scat and prints, bigger than any native animals. Third, the forest trees. Those were damaged, broken, but not like normal storm damage. While the Ozarks are no stranger to storm damage, the trees I came across that night were different. They were not just knocked down, they were splintered, shredded. They looked as if something had torn through them, something big and powerful. More than that, the damage was high up, much higher than any bear could reach. It was as if a tornado had swept through, but only in a narrowly defined path. The sight was uncanny, and it chilled me more than the night air. That's when I saw it. The moon was full, providing enough light to see something massive ahead. It stood about 6 feet tall. Its body was shrouded in black feathers, obscuring most of it. As I approached, it unfurled wings, large and bat-like, stretching wide across the forest floor. As the creature spread its wings, I could see how incredibly large they were, almost equal in size to its body. The moonlight filtered through the black, leathery material, casting an eerie glow on the forest floor. They seemed less like wings you'd find on a bird, and more like those you'd associate with bats, with visible veins and joints. I could hear a slight rustling of leaves and twigs under the creature's size and weight. The wings' sheer size and the sight of them opening up, filling the quiet forest with their presence, was an image that's been seared into my memory. Its face, or rather, the lack thereof, was the part that really threw me off. No discernible facial features, just 2 large, reflective red eyes that glowed ominously. I froze, heart hammering against my ribcage as those eyes locked onto mine. In that stillness, it was incredible how the eyes held my attention. They were too large to match any animal I knew, with a depth and intensity that was almost hypnotic. The red glow they emitted wasn't like the reflection of light you'd see in an animal caught in a headlight. Instead, they glowed with an internal luminescence, reflecting off nothing, staring back at me with an awareness that was terrifying. It was as if they were seeing right through me. I could almost feel their gaze on my skin, raising goosebumps and causing a cold shiver to run down my spine. In the immediate aftermath, I scrambled backwards. Once I broke away from its gaze and stumbled back, I managed to pull my radio from my belt and call for backup. The signal was staticky and weak, just like my own shaken voice as I tried to describe what I'd seen. The eyes, the wings, the splintered trees, how do you put that into words? By the time my fellow rangers arrived with their headlights illuminating the scene, all that remained were the massive prints. The impressions were deep and large, much like the owner who'd left them behind. And though the creature had vanished, a faint otherworldly screech still echoed around us, a chilling reminder of the encounter. Ever since then, I've been plagued with nightmares of those glowing red eyes, of massive wings stirring up the forest floor. The encounter affected me more than I'd like to admit. The nights that followed were restless, haunted by dreams of large, glowing red eyes watching me from the dark corners of my room. Each sound in the night would set my heart racing, recalling the echo of massive wings in those eyes. I'd wake up in cold sweats, the image of the creature etched into my mind. I filed for a transfer soon after, wanting to get away from the forest and the memories it held. However, the slow grind of bureaucracy has left me stuck here, my request for transfer lost in a sea of paperwork. Meanwhile, every night spent here feels like a countdown, a dreaded anticipation of another encounter. I'm a hunting guide by profession, based in Montana. Never thought I'd be writing in about something like this, but here we are. Last Tuesday, I was leading a group through the Gallatin National Forest. We were tracking elk. Nothing out of the ordinary for that day, just going through the motions of explaining tracking signs and showing the group how to spot the fresh tracks and droppings. Around dusk, we started noticing a few odd things. Firstly, the forest was too quiet. Now, I've been in the woods enough to know that when it gets that quiet, something's not right. Then the stench hit us. Not just wet dog, but something else mixed in, like the smell of garbage that's been sitting in the hot sun, with a weird hint of sulfur. We stumbled upon this creature next. I say stumbled upon because I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it myself. It was massive. I'd say somewhere between 7 to 9 feet tall. The moonlight made its black and brown fur glisten, muscles rippling under the skin as it moved. It had a hump on its back, and a massive body that made me think of those bodybuilder types, all wide shoulders and big chest. But what really stuck with me was the face. It had a snout like a German shepherd but broader, and I could see a double row of teeth, fangs really, that shone in the moonlight. The ears were pointy, reminded me of a Doberman pinscher. It had a demonic look to it, and the eyes, they were the worst part, glowing faintly in the dark. The encounter felt surreal, like something out of a horror movie. I've been hunting for the better part of 3 decades, but this thing scared me. I felt a cold rush of fear, my heart pounding in my chest like a jackhammer. The creature seemed to be as surprised to see us as we were to see it. It let out this low, guttural growl before it took off into the woods. It didn't run like an animal would. It stood upright on its hind legs, just like a man. After the creature disappeared, we all just stood there for a moment, shell-shocked. We quickly packed up and left the area. On the way back, nobody talked much. The encounter left us all with a feeling of unease. We got back to town around midnight. Next day, I returned to the area with a few of the local guys. I felt obligated to, in case this thing was a threat to folks around here. The smell was gone by then, but we could see clear signs where it had been broken branches, disturbed ground. As professionals, we couldn't help but inspect its tracks. The footprints were like nothing we'd seen before. They looked somewhat like a dog's, but were far too large, and there was a clear bipedal pattern. They were scattered around the area, too randomly for my liking. It didn't feel like the creature was scared or fleeing, more like it was curious and observing us. The tracks led to a dead elk nearby. It was ripped apart and the smell of blood was overwhelming. The way it was killed, it seemed more savage than any natural predator I've come across. The scene was brutal, as if something had played with its food. Everyone was quiet on the way back. There's a tension in town now. People are scared, and with good reason. This isn't a ghost story or some urban legend. It's real, and it's here in our backwoods. This isn't just for the thrill of the story, but also as a caution for those in the area or planning a trip here soon. The woods are a beautiful place, but they're also wild, and sometimes they remind us just how wild they can be. I'm a trucker by trade. I've been driving big rigs all across the United States for nearly 20 years now. My story's not about your usual sighting on the highways, though. It's something different, something I can't explain. I was on a run from Nevada to New Mexico, hauling a load of construction supplies. My path took me through a long, lonely stretch of desert where the only company you have is the radio and the stars. About halfway into the route, it was already late. The only light came from my truck's headlights and the faint shimmer of the stars above. I decided to stop for a bit, stretch my legs, and get some fresh air. Now, I've been on the road long enough to pick up on when something's off. That night, there was this unsettling quiet. Not your usual desert silence, but a heavy, absolute hush that sends shivers down your spine. Then I noticed this awful smell, like rotten meat and burnt hair, real strong. I can still remember it. Out of nowhere, I saw this figure standing about 100 yards from my rig, staring right at me. This creature was tall, between 6 and 10 feet, I'd reckon, and its eyes, damn, those eyes were yellow, like 2 pieces of glass catching the light of a harvest moon. Now, I've seen a lot of things on the road, but I've never seen anything like this. This creature looked like it came straight out of a Jurassic Park movie, half human, half dinosaur, standing upright like a man but with a head more like a lizard's. I could see the outline of big black claws in my headlights. I won't lie, I was scared. This thing gave off a vibe that I will describe as pure evil. My heart was pounding so hard, I swear I could hear it in my ears. But I couldn't look away from those damn eyes. Then as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. One moment it was there, the next it just vanished as if swallowed by the night. I was left there, heart racing, with only the silent desert as a witness. Once I felt sure the creature had disappeared, I took several deep breaths, trying to steady my trembling hands. The desert had returned to its usual state, a desolate expanse bathed in moonlight, but I could still feel a lingering sense of unease, like the echo of a scream in an empty house. I decided I couldn't stay out there any longer. Clambering back into the cab of my truck, I started up the engine. Its usual comforting rumble now felt like a lifeline to reality, a soothing counterpoint to the uncanny silence that had descended moments before. As I resumed my journey, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature's yellow eyes or its towering silhouette in the distance. The high beam from my headlights seemed feeble in the vast darkness of the desert, providing scant reassurance against the terror that had taken hold of me. For the rest of that run, I was on high alert, senses heightened to any unusual sound or movement in the desolate landscape. Every shadow seemed menacing, every wind-blown tumbleweed a potential threat. It felt like the longest drive of my life. After that encounter, my perspective on those late-night runs changed. The solitude of the open road, once a source of peace, now felt ominous. I started avoiding that route, opting for busier highways whenever I could. Every time I got behind the wheel, I found myself fighting the memory of that night and the terror I felt. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, the image of that creature and its piercing yellow eyes burnt into my mind. I've spent countless hours trying to make sense of it, questioning if it was real or just a product of my tired mind. I was a volunteer firefighter when those really bad wildfires hit Northern California. I'm actually from Idaho, but they flew me and some of my friends down there to help out because the blaze was so out of control. It's just unimaginable destruction and made me really sad to see all the homes and neighborhoods totally destroyed. They had us camping a good distance away from any of the fires, and every night someone was on watch and radio. We were always on high alert because, with the change of the wind, miles could easily turn into minutes. I had been there for a week, maybe a week and a half. We had just pulled a 15 or 16-hour day and we were finishing up dinner, so probably close to 11 or 12 at night. This guy Casey comes running over and tells us to follow him to the back of camp. I mean, back of camp is generous because that group had maybe 25 or 30 tents. We followed him over to near the train tracks and he was yelling about a weird sound he'd heard while taking a smoke. I couldn't hear anything, and neither could anyone else, but Casey was never like this. He was super chill and never made a big deal about anything. I think he was an English teacher or something at one point. I didn't know him super well. I had only worked with him once before. He ran down the train tracks. It was getting dark, but the fires were keeping it somewhat light out, so you could still sort of see what was happening. There was an overall glow to the situation. Casey had a pretty big head start on us, and we soon lost him in some trees up ahead. It was sometime right around then when the wind decided to change. The fire got to us quickly, but you see, the thing is, the fire was there way too fast. It should have taken an hour at least to make the distance that it did, but somehow all of a sudden everything was blazing. The trees, the grass, the wood of the railroad tracks. I saw that the metal of the railroad tracks was also on fire. None of this was normal. Everything was happening too fast. We were surrounded on every side by walls of fire, and it was closing in on us. I looked up, and the flames were above us too. I thought I was imagining it at first, but then Nancy, the other lady on the team, started yelling through the roar of the fire. "Do you hear that?" It was a strange cross between a hiss and a hum. It was deep and at the same time high-pitched. I could feel it under my skin. The fire brightened up where Casey had disappeared. The ground began to rumble, and I realized the hissing was coming from below. A giant sort of fireball exploded upwards in front of us. The fire around us grew lower, except for in front of us where it grew even brighter. I saw what looked like the outline of a person deep in the fire. I thought it was Casey, but the closer I looked, the stranger it appeared. It was hard to tell, but it was probably 7 or 8 feet tall. There was no way someone could withstand that heat either. It was impossible. The shrieky humming grew louder, and I realized the creature was running towards us. Its front limbs were long swinging until it got closer, and then it felt like it was reaching. I dove out of the way. The flames were trailing with it. It could have been the source of the fire. The second before I blacked out, I rolled over and got a glimpse of its legs, which looked like the hind legs of an animal, maybe a horse or a goat or something like that. I woke up and didn't know how long I'd been out, but it must have been a while because it was starting to get light out, and not just from the nearby wildfires. The sun was coming up and I could see I wasn't the only one who passed out. Nancy and some of the guys were nearby on the ground too. I checked on them all and they were alive and breathing but still out. I looked around and saw a giant hole where part of the railroad track had been. Some of the metal had sort of melted and dripped down the side of the hole. It looked like icicles. I went to the edge of the hole, which was more like a pit, probably at least 10 or 15 feet deep. The sides of it were caked in ash. Turning around, I realized that nothing had actually been burned. The track had melted a bit. A few feet on either side of the pit were a little charred, but everything else was unburnt. Green grass and weeds, the trees were still covered in needles, and the trunks were untouched. There was a stripe or maybe path of grass that had been kind of crisped. It went from the pit to over the hill in the direction of the wildfires. Once everyone woke up and determined no one was too badly hurt, we searched for 3 or 4 hours but couldn't find any sign of Casey. I'm not sure what we saw, but we all saw it. My name is Alex, and before the encounter I was just an average guy, a little interested in the unknown, but nothing too much. However, ever since this encounter it feels like I've shifted. It's like my perspective on everything has changed. I was never one to dwell on the abstract or the supernatural. I was more a facts and figures kind of guy. If you couldn't explain it with numbers and charts, it didn't hold much weight for me. But this encounter, it really shook me. It's like a veil was lifted and I found myself questioning things I'd always taken for granted. Suddenly the world felt bigger, scarier, but also more intriguing than it had ever been. It was as if I had been given a sneak peek into a dimension I never knew existed. I was at my uncle's place, helping him with some renovation work. He lives pretty much in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest. Not exactly my cup of tea, but family is family. My uncle's property, it's a good chunk of land, mostly forested. It's quiet, peaceful to a point, but also kind of eerie. In a way, it feels like you're stepping back in time when you go out there, with the forest stretching in all directions, untouched by the modern world. Not to mention, the nearest neighbor is miles away. During the day, you could appreciate the solitude and the beauty of nature, but at night, the isolation could feel a bit unsettling. It's just you and the wilderness. And as I found out, maybe not just you. I didn't know much about local legends or anything. I'd heard stories from my uncle about weird stuff happening in the woods, but I thought he was just trying to scare me, you know? Typical stuff. I wasn't a believer, I suppose you could say. Then one evening, while I was taking a break, I saw something. At first, I thought it was just a person hunched over, but as I looked closer, I saw it wasn't. It was pale, almost sickly looking. Not ghost white or anything, just off. It was on all fours, but its body was oddly proportioned, like it was supposed to stand upright. It was disturbingly quick, too. It moved like nothing I'd ever seen. It was strange to say the least. It was as if it was struggling against its own form, the way it moved. Imagine watching a person trying to run on all fours, but at a speed that seemed unnatural. It was just not right. And the paleness of its skin was almost like a light in the dark, like moonlight reflected on a calm lake. It gave off an uncanny vibe. Something inside me screamed that this was very wrong, definitely not something that belonged in the world as I knew it. I froze, I couldn't move. All I could do was watch as it clicked, the noise echoing around the silent woods. Its face had those large black eyes, no nose, just this gaping mouth. Like something out of a nightmare. But it didn't approach me. It just looked at me, then turned and sprinted off into the woods. When our eyes met, it felt like time stopped. I remember the chill running down my spine, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. It just sat there, clicking. The sound was alien. It had this weird rhythm, almost hypnotic. Its face haunts me to this day. Those enormous black eyes felt like they were staring right into my soul. The lack of a nose in that open mouth, it was something straight out of a horror movie. But it was real as the cold beer in my hand. And then, as abruptly as it had appeared, it vanished into the dense forest, leaving me alone with my shock and fear. After it was gone, it took me a few minutes to collect myself. Once I got back inside, I didn't go back out, not until the sun was up. The next day, I packed my bags and left. I couldn't stay there knowing that that thing was out there. From then on, I was more cautious. More aware, I suppose. And that's the real kicker, isn't it? How something like that can make you see things differently. After the creature had gone, I sat there in silence, my mind racing. I felt a sudden urge to pack my bags and leave, but I forced myself to stay put until dawn. It was a long night, filled with every creak and rustle magnified by my heightened senses. When I finally left the next day, the forest no longer seemed peaceful. It felt different, charged with a new sense of awareness. It was a harsh lesson about the mysteries that our world still holds, a reminder that there's so much we don't know. The experience made me more cautious, more observant, not just of the wilderness, but of life itself. It's funny how a single encounter can jolt you out of your usual path, make you question and, in a way, open your eyes to the possibilities. It changed me and made me more curious and more open to the unexplained. My name is John Collins, a scientist by day but also a nature enthusiast with an insatiable curiosity for the mysteries that lie hidden within the natural world. I've always been drawn to the unexplored corners of our planet, seeking out remote and lesser-known areas. It was during one of my solo expeditions to the rugged forests of Northern California that I had an encounter that defied explanation. It was a warm summer day as I ventured into the depths of the Shasta Trinity National Forest. Towering redwoods stood tall, casting dappled shadows upon the forest floor. The date was June 12, 2019, a day that would forever be etched in my memory. Guided by an unyielding curiosity, I ventured deep into the forest, my eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of wildlife. And then, a peculiar sound reached my ears, a subtle rustling amidst the dense undergrowth. My heart quickened, sensing that something extraordinary awaited me. With cautious steps, I followed the source of the sound. Every fiber of my being was consumed by anticipation and an unexplainable thrill. And there, in a small sunlit clearing, I beheld a creature that defied every preconception I had. The creature stood before me, its body adorned in sleek charcoal gray fur that shimmered in the sunlight. It possessed a muscular frame, a blend of bear and ape, hinting at a predatory agility and strength. Its forelimbs were elongated, contributing to its slightly hunched posture, while the hind limbs appeared shorter in comparison. But it was the creature's face that held me captive, a convergence of human and animal features. Its prominent snout bore a striking resemblance to that of a bear, complete with a damp black nose. Yet it was its eyes that held my gaze captive, piercing and wise as if they carried the weight of millennia. Time seemed to freeze as we locked eyes, and a connection passed between us, unspoken and profound. It held no hostility or aggression, only an unspoken understanding that I was a respectful observer in its domain. The creature's rounded ears swiveled independently, attentive to its surroundings. Moving with a blend of grace and purpose, the creature exhibited a primal allure that awakened a mix of fear and reverence within me. Its presence embodied the fusion of animalistic power and ancient wisdom, a living embodiment of forgotten legends. My hands trembled as I attempted to capture the moment, desperate to preserve this surreal encounter. But the creature, as if sensing my limitations, chose to retreat into the depths of the forest. It vanished with a swiftness that left me spellbound, disappearing into the emerald embrace of the towering redwoods. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, yet the memory of that encounter lingered, etching itself into the very fabric of my being. Determined to uncover the truth, I delved deep into the annals of folklore and local legends. But despite all I found, skepticism prevailed, and few dared to believe in the existence of such a creature. Undeterred, I sought out experts in the field of cryptozoology, desperate for any lead that might shed light on the enigma I had witnessed. Some dismissed my account as mere fantasy, but a select few seasoned researchers shared tantalizing fragments of information. They spoke of a hidden realm concealed within the depths of the Shasta Trinity National Forest, where cryptids roamed, veiled from prying eyes. The creature I had encountered was said to be a guardian of this realm, a sentinel charged with safeguarding its secrets from human intrusion. Though the world may dismiss my encounter as mere illusion, I carry the weight of truth within me. The creature I encountered in the remote forests of Northern California remains nameless, shrouded in the allure of the unseen. I stand as a witness to the delicate balance between belief and skepticism. We are but explorers, seekers of knowledge, forever on the precipice of unraveling the secrets that lie beyond our understanding. So let the skeptics scoff and the naysayers dismiss. I will continue to embrace the mysteries that nature presents, venturing into the unknown with reverence and an unyielding determination to uncover the veiled secrets that lie hidden within the redwoods of Northern California. Ever since I was young, I always wanted to be in the medical field. I was a certified nursing assistant for a couple of years before I eventually entered medical school. I worked in a nursing home in a small town in Michigan. When you work in a nursing home, you essentially grow the size of your family. You become so close with them, you meet their family, learn about their lives, look forward to their stories, laugh with them, cry with them, and even though it's hard work, it's very rewarding. I can't tell you how many patients have told me that I was like a child to them. These patients will always have a special place in my heart. There was this lovely old woman named Mrs. Clark who was always full of life. She always wore this old red hat and her teeth were terrible. Despite these quirks, she was by far one of my favorite patients. About 2 weeks before she died, she would talk about these 3 little girls that were following her around. Every time I would check on her, she would have new stories about what these 3 little girls recently did. As she told it, they'd say crazy things to her, make her laugh, show her their toys, and she always had a new story about these girls. I never saw any of these girls, obviously. I figured it was just her dementia playing tricks on her mind at the time. Then Mrs. Clark passed, and it was one of the hardest deaths I've had to deal with as a CNA. Then a new patient, Mrs. McConaughey, ended up moving into her room. She was a very calm and cheerful old woman. She always had a smile on her face and never caused any problems. She was gentle as a lamb, and being in her presence was very soothing. She reminded me of my own grandmother, and I would always spend extra time with her. Then all of a sudden, Mrs. McConaughey started talking to me about 3 little girls that would visit her. They would tell her about their days, they would bring her toys, tell her jokes, and dance around her bed. Every time I visited her room, she had a new story about these 3 little girls. It was too coincidental, and I started to really listen intently to Mrs. McConaughey when she would talk about these 3 little girls. I knew for a fact that there weren't any actual young girls that were visiting her. Initially, I thought there had to be someone's daughters that would visit the nursing home, but only Mrs. McConaughey was seeing them. Then, Mrs. McConaughey passed away. Shortly after that, we had the next patient move into her room named Mr. Mason. Mr. Mason was awesome. He was really kind-hearted and jovial. He was always a gentleman, and he would tell the best stories from his past. Most people his age like to tell the same stories over and over again, but Mr. Mason always had a new, amazing story to tell. He was really funny and could always get the whole room laughing. He was very active in the nursing home activities, and everyone just loved him. A couple of weeks before he died, Mr. Mason started mentioning the 3 little girls. He would talk about how he loved how playful they were and how happy they always were. This really freaked me out. He was the 3rd patient in a row to talk about these girls. Nobody else in the nursing home was telling stories about these 3 girls. It was just the patients in that particular room. It was very unsettling. Then one night, my coworker Sarah and I were both assisting Mr. Mason in getting ready for bed. All of a sudden, he asks me, "Who's that standing next to you?" I replied, "Don't be silly, Mr. Mason. You know Sarah, you see her all the time." He shook his head and said, "No, the other one standing next to her?" Sarah and I both looked at each other, and I could feel the adrenaline shoot through my limbs. This was getting to be too much. In fact, it was becoming absolutely terrifying. Mr. Mason passed away later that evening, and I relocated shortly after that, but couldn't get these 3 girls out of my mind. Years later, I made a shocking discovery. I was visiting friends down the street from that nursing home and learned that there had been a terrible fire at the location years before the nursing home was built. There was a barn that caught fire, and 3 little girls were burned alive. I'm sure my eyes went wide when I learned those facts, but I kept my thoughts to myself, knowing that my story would never sound possible. When you work with the sick and the elderly, you develop a unique relationship with death and energy. Strange things often happen to people when their time comes, and I feel like pretty much every nurse has some crazy story to tell. But I think about those 3 little girls a lot. I wish that before I moved away from Michigan, I could have done something to help those girls move on into the next life. Before I die, I would like to return to that room and at least tell them that it's okay to move on. I'm no supernatural expert, but I know that something is keeping them from moving on into the afterworld. The face Mr. Mason made when he asked who was beside Sarah was really disturbing. I'm thinking that whatever or whoever he saw is what is keeping them there. I hope I can figure it out. My name's Jake. I'm an avid hiker from Oregon. I thought I'd share something with you that happened to me a couple of weeks ago while hiking in the Cascade range. So I was in the Cascades on a solo trip. I wanted to spend some time alone with nature and figured there's no better place to do so than the Oregon wilderness. I was on my 3rd day of hiking, aiming to reach a remote alpine lake that I'd heard was particularly beautiful this time of year. It was late afternoon when I first noticed something unusual. I was navigating a steep trail, still a good hour from the lake, when I heard an unfamiliar noise echoing through the trees. It was a low growl that didn't match anything I've heard in the wild. My first thought was a bear, but it didn't sound right. Too deep, too guttural. A sudden foul stench hit me next. A mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I couldn't quite place. A sulfurous smell. My heart started racing, and I knew instantly something was off. I've seen my share of wildlife in my time, but this was different, almost unsettling. And then I saw it. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as my vision focused, I could clearly see this massive creature standing upright about 50 yards away. It was tall, around 8 feet by my guess, with a massive body that looked like it belonged to a bodybuilder. I noticed a thick, dark mane around its neck and shoulders, resembling a cape draped over its wide shoulders. Its legs were thick and muscular, like those of a dog, yet they ended in what looked like human feet. The creature's face was partially hidden by the shadow of the trees, but I could make out a long, broad snout and 2 pointy ears that looked similar to a German shepherd's. It let out another guttural growl. Despite the fear, I was entranced. It was terrifying yet fascinating. The wilderness had always been a source of peace for me, but in that moment, I felt fear. I also felt a strange sense of wonder, the kind you feel when confronted by something utterly foreign, something that challenges your understanding of the world. Still trying to make sense of what I was seeing, I instinctively reached for my phone to take a photo. But the creature's ears twitched, and it quickly turned its head towards me, revealing a face that was eerily dog-like, yet somehow monstrous. The snout was broad and looked almost like that of a Doberman pinscher, while the mouth revealed a double row of teeth and terrifyingly large fangs. Its eyes were not visible in the shadow, adding to its unnerving presence. With a realization that felt like a punch in the gut, I remembered the sounds I'd heard earlier. That low, guttural growl must have come from this creature. I was on its turf now. All my years of hiking and outdoor experience seemed to pale in the face of this unknown entity. Suddenly, the creature let out a howl, a sound so haunting and eerie it still gives me chills to think about. It was nothing like a typical wolf's howl. There was something almost human about it. I was frozen in fear, my heart pounding in my chest. The stench of rotting meat and sulfur was even stronger now, and it took all my willpower to keep myself from gagging. In a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the creature looked at me and then, surprisingly, turned and disappeared into the dense forest, its huge, humped back and wide shoulders visible until the trees swallowed it. It didn't run, didn't seem scared. Rather, it moved with a strange grace, like it had all the time in the world. Once it was out of sight, I stood still listening. The forest seemed to hold its breath along with me. After what seemed like an eternity, the silence was broken only by the distant chirping of birds. It was over. But I was left with a pounding heart and shaking legs. After the encounter, I was in shock for a while, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just witnessed. I quickly packed up and made my way back to my camp, every little sound making me jump. I stayed awake all night, startled by every noise, half expecting the creature to return. But it didn't. Once I was out of the woods and back to civilization, I tried to research what I had seen. I found tales of mythical creatures, folklore, but nothing that really matched what I had encountered. I've also reached out to local wildlife experts, but so far no one can explain it. It's like nothing anyone's heard of around these parts. I still hike, but I can't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I'm out there in the wilderness. The world feels a little different, a little less familiar now. I hope sharing my experience might help me and maybe others who've had similar encounters feel less alone. My name is Jack, and I'm a bridge welder by trade. You might be wondering why a guy who spends his days working on bridges is writing to a show host about mythical creatures. Well, even welders need hobbies, right? Mine happens to be hiking. It's a welcome break from the welding mask and torch, and I get to enjoy the peace and quiet of nature. Last weekend, I decided to take a solo trip through the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. I was halfway through my usual trail, savoring the feeling of the earth beneath my boots and the sound of leaves crunching, when I noticed something was off. The usual woodland noises, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, were replaced by an eerie silence. That's when I smelled it. Sulfur. A strong, nauseating scent that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was as though someone had lit a pile of rotten eggs on fire right in the middle of the forest. I've been hiking for years, and let me tell you, that smell isn't normal. And then I saw it. Standing a distance away in a clearing was this creature, a thing straight out of a nightmare. It was massive, easily reaching 8 feet tall, and its body was a bizarre mix that reminded me of a lizard and a goat, with bat-like wings folded at its sides. Its skin was brown and scaly like the rusted beams I often repair. The face, though. It was terrifying, glowing yellow eyes boring into mine. It looked oddly like a horse, yet twisted into something monstrous. A long tongue flicked out of a mouth filled with sharp teeth. And the way it looked at me, there was an intelligence there that made my skin crawl. The creature didn't just stand there. It moved, revealing more of its bizarre appearance. Its black skeletal body stretched grotesquely as it unfurled its wings. They weren't exactly bat-like as I initially thought, more dragon-like, leathery and huge, casting an ominous shadow on the forest floor. The thing's legs were bent, similar to a goat's, but with an eerie skeletal thinness to them. The creature's long tail whipped restlessly behind it, moving with a strange agility that contradicted its otherwise ungainly appearance. And atop its terrifying face, 2 horns protruded. They were twisted and dark as if scorched, adding to its demonic aura. Its eyes continued to glow, a chilling yellow that seemed to pierce through the semi-darkness of the forest. And every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of its long tongue darting out, flicking through the air as if tasting it. But what was truly bone-chilling was when it made a sound. A low rumble echoed through the clearing, almost like a growl, but with an unnatural resonance. The kind of sound you'd expect to come from a creature of nightmares, not something standing in front of you in the flesh. The encounter didn't last long after that. It seemed to lose interest in me, those glowing eyes shifting away. With one powerful leap, it was airborne, those monstrous wings beating against the air and causing a rush of wind that nearly knocked me off my feet. The last thing I saw was a silhouette disappearing into the darkening sky, leaving nothing but the sulfurous smell and the haunting memory behind. After the creature flew off, I was left in a state of disarray. With my heart still hammering in my chest, I began the hasty trek back towards civilization. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. As a bridge welder, I'm used to finding solutions to structural problems. But this was beyond any logic or understanding I was equipped with. Once I reached my truck, I found my hands were still shaking. I sat there for a while, the scent of sulfur lingering in my nostrils, replaying the encounter in my mind. Eventually, I turned the key in the ignition and began the drive home, the image of the creature's glowing yellow eyes etched in my memory. Over the following days, I tried to go about my daily routine. The sound of welding filled the days and gave me a sense of normalcy. Yet every now and then, I'd find my thoughts drifting back to the creature. The smell of sulfur seemed to follow me too, no matter how many showers I took or how many times I washed my clothes. I did some research, thinking I'd stumbled upon a yet undiscovered animal, maybe even a new species. The more I read, the more I came across tales of the Jersey Devil. Every description I read matched what I'd seen: the lizard goat body, the horse-like face, the sulfurous smell. I'd always dismissed such tales as folklore, but there was no denying the uncanny similarities. I've even returned to the Pine Barrens a couple of times since then, drawn by a need for answers. I didn't see the creature again, but I did find strange tracks and once again encountered that awful sulfur smell. And it's not just me. Other hikers have reported similar sightings and smells in the same area. My hope in writing to you is not only to share my encounter, but to find some answers. Maybe your listeners can shine a light on this encounter in the comments section. Help me understand what we've experienced.